your experience level. I assume there are people for whom this is their first competition. Are there?
No.
No, okay, well, very good. Then I'll keep this very brief. Please interrupt me if there are any questions at any point, because I think that way this will be far more productive than if I just talk here alone. So firstly, we're going to, something interesting happens. Firstly, we're going to look at motion types, just in order to understand what kind of a burden each of the different motion types set. These things that you have to be arguing about obviously come from the motion, and they're somewhat different in terms of what the motion type is and so forth. So we're going to go through some of the most common motion types that there are. Firstly, in terms of policy motions, they're worded as this house would. This is probably something that all of you have seen before. For example, this house would ban zoos, okay? This is a policy, and you are supposed to debate whether this policy should be passed, right? So whether this should be made as a law or not. Most often, this is from the perspective of the government, in that this house would ban zoos. It's quite obvious that the government is probably the actor in the country that would do something like ban some kind of business or zoos from or whatever from taking place. In this case, you have what is called as government fiat, which means that you can assume that this policy will pass the parliament. So the opposition argument saying that no, they will oppose this in the parliament and that we cannot do this because it's impossible is not a permissible argument based on the rules of the debate format. You have to assume that the motion is one, something that will pass the political system, but also two, something that actually can be done. You can question how effectively it can be done and how smart it is to do it and what kind of adverse effects it will have, but you cannot say, no, we don't think this is a thing that can possibly be done in opposition. The key strategy in terms of debating these motions is to obviously provide some kind of a model, right? So the proposition team needs to explain what their policy would look like, and their fiat extends to explaining the details of that policy. So for example, if I were to debate this house would ban zoos, I would be allowed to say, what do we do with these zoos? For example, whether I want to slaughter all the animals straight up, or whether I want to allow them to stay there until the currently captive animals die, and what kind of punishment maybe we want to put on individuals that break this law and still have an illegal zoo or whatever. Now, you don't want to go into like a huge amount of detail on this, but you do wish to, especially if you think that there are like problematic ways of implementing this and good ways of implementing this, you probably do wish to give a model that explains that you know what you're doing and that you kind of avoid the biggest problems by giving a sensible model. The second key strategy is to try to find a problem, right? Usually when a government passes some policy, there is some reason why the government passes the policy. Governments don't pass laws just for fun, right? Therefore, it's better if you find some kind of a problem in the world that you're trying to solve by having this policy motion pass, and therefore explain why this is an effective solution and why this is effectively the only way how you can solve that problem, or better than the alternatives that exist. So that's a strategy for debating policy motions. The second, which unfortunately looks very similar and is not to be confused, I don't think we're doing this here, but I think this is still important to bring this up, is this house would from a perspective of an individual, right? So it is possible for us to have a motion, this house would not eat meat, in which case this would make no sense if this meant the government would not eat meat, right? It has to be a general debate from the perspective of an individual. Or this house would take the Pascal's wager or whatever. Like there are other examples where this can come into play. So this is not from one actor perspective, it's general perspective, but it is a question of should this individual or should like a general average person take this action or not. How do you recognize this? One, by understanding that none of this would make any sense if we debated this from the perspective of the government. Two, by the motion not being understandable in any way if it wasn't an individual decision that people would collectively do. People do this sometimes, but I think we're not going to do them in any case. Off to analysis motions. The first type is where you have something called as this house believes that. For example, this house believes that religious leaders should not comment on political issues. The key burden in this is not to pass a policy, but rather to discuss whether the statement that follows, this house believes that, is true or not, whether it's a good idea to do or not. So for example, in this case, this house believes that religious leaders should not comment on political issues. We should discuss whether this is a good or bad thing that they don't comment on political issues. Please note the significant difference to a policy motion. We are not banning them from commenting on political issues, meaning that any argument that goes along the lines of they have the right as citizens to comment on political issues just like anyone else is probably not very relevant to this debate because we're not doing anything to take that right away. We're not banning anything. There's no policy. This is just a question of whether they should or whether they should not. Strategy here is a bit different. The proposition side, crucially, has no fiat to explain what the model looks like. That means that the proposition, if it was, for example, that this house believes that religious leaders should not comment on political issues, doesn't have the right to say what they would comment on instead. If it was, for example, this house believes that governments should ban zoos, in comparison to a previous zoo motion or policy motion, if it was worded that this house believes that government should do it, then the government team in the debate has no right to decide on how they would do it. They just have to defend it as the government in the real world would be likely to do that. So you don't have fiat over what the detail of the policy would look like. So you don't have to provide a model, and you're not even allowed really to provide a detailed model. You rather would have to look for some kind of a metric, right? You would have to look for, given that there are obvious benefits and harms to something, like for example, the religious leaders not commenting on political issues, you would have to look at how, in general, what's the most important part, how the debate should be judged based on that, and try to provide kind of a weighing between the arguments for the judge. This is probably the most important piece of strategy for analysis motions. Second type of analysis motions that there are is motions that say this house supports or this house opposes. So for example, this house supports or opposes hacking as a form of protest. Okay? The key burden here is whether or not this is something that we should support in general or not. Whether it's a good thing that does more good than harm, or vice versa, right? So crucially, this house supports does not mean that we would give material support or any other kind of support. So if I would say this house, we had the motion, this house supports hacking as a form of protest, it doesn't mean we would give money to hackers, it doesn't mean we would make a public statement about whether or not hacking is good. It's just a debate on whether or not we think that this is something that does more good than harm. So it could be reworded effectively as this house believes that hacking as a form of protest does more harm than good if it was opposes, and then vice versa for the other one. This is it's very similar to the believes that motion, but it's just a shorter way of explaining it. Again, you need to look for a metric, and you're not supposed to provide a model. Then we have actual motions, which look like this. So this house, as X, would then do Y. In this case, this house, as maybe Donald Trump, or as EU, would stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia. Here the crucial thing is, there is not a believes that motion that assumes a neutral perspective. It is a debate from the perspective of the actor that you are given, and therefore you have to debate what is in the interest of that particular actor. So you have to do two things. You have to explain what the interest of that actor in general is, and then why that motion somehow suits the interest of that particular actor. I guess the most common mistake is to try to make these not debates about what is in their interest, but rather debates about what they would do in the real life. And so the purpose is not to argue that we think that based on historical patterns EU is likely to do this. It's not a question of whether it's a probabilistic thing that is likely to happen in the real world, but rather it is a question of what would be in their interest, both in their practical interest, but also in their principled interest if you believe that they have some kind of principled moral obligations or other things that they should follow. So you have to describe and characterize the interests, values and metrics from the actor's perspective, and only talk about the general interest if you can explain why the actor will care about this. So if we had some kind of a deal about, well, for example, this house's EU would stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia, you could make the argument that less people will die in war in Yemen if we sell less weapons to Saudi Arabia, but you have to then explain why EU will care about the fact that less people will die in Yemen, because it's from the perspective of EU. Now that's very easy, usually people care about others dying, right? But in other cases it's less trivial. I think this is probably the last motion type, counterfactual motions. So this house regrets. So for example, this house regrets the rise of cryptocurrencies, for example, Bitcoin. The key burden here is to compare what we have currently and what we are regretting to an alternative world that would have existed if this thing did not exist, right? So therefore, it's not a question of whether we think something is just in isolation currently good, but it's also a historical question of if we did not have this, than what we would have instead, and whether that would be better. Now, with the rise of cryptocurrencies, I'm not sure can you claim what would have happened without, but if you, for example, take a very wild motion, say this house regrets the fall of Western Rome, then you probably have to discuss what would have happened if this kind of historical thing didn't happen, or regrets the independence of some country, or whatever, right? So you have to look at the historical counterfactual, but both you have to look at also the real world, like consequences that this have had, and then compare that to. Crucially, opposition team should challenge, and I think this is where most people can go wrong, they should challenge what the counterfactual looks like. So not only whether this is good or not, this thing we currently have, but if, for example, we had this crazy idea of regretting the fall of Rome, okay, and then the proposition said that the world would be perfect and we had no dark ages where bad things happened if we didn't have fall of Rome, then the opposition should stand up and question the alternative that they say, that that's not the realistic alternative, the realistic alternative is rather this. So you can kind of debate also what the realistic alternative would look like, and you should debate that. Any questions on motion types? All too easy. Okay. Very few remarks on rules that I think will be even easier, but just write reminders. There are 4 teams in a debate. Each of them will have 2 speakers, and they will speak in the order that is indicated by the arrows in this. And there will be a panel of adjudicators to adjudicate the debate, or in some cases, there will be 1 judge, okay? Good. On fiat and counter-proposal, so proposition has the right to assume that the motion will go through, so that it passes the legislative body, and that it's possible to pass the motion. So, for example, if we had a motion, this house would legalize all drugs, we have to assume that it's possible to legalize all drugs, but you can discuss how effective that is. If we had the motion, this house would ban alcohol, we have to assume that there will be a law that will ban alcohol, but then we can obviously discuss whether or not people will still drink, even if we ban alcohol or not, right? In policy motions and policy motions alone, like we discussed, opposition has the right to provide a counter proposal. Now, that means that they can provide an idea that should be done instead. So if we, for example, had a motion of this house would give money to group X, the opposition can say that we should give money to purpose Y instead, right? This is the classic, but you can have different counter proposals. Some criteria on what a legitimate counter proposal looks like. 1, it needs to consume equal amount of resources and political capital. So if the motion says, for example, that this house would legalize all drugs, and the proposition tells you that all of the people are so addicted and there are so many problems and we're going to solve this by legalizing drugs, opposition cannot tell me that we're going to invest billions upon billions in some kind of a treatment program for these people, because that clearly is more expensive than a simple law that just says that we should legalize all drugs. So equal amount of resources. Equal amount of political capital should also be required, right? So it cannot be that it will be some genuinely out there thing that nobody would ever accept to, that would be your alternative, that you would be running. The third thing, which is not on the slide, is that it still has to be oppositional to the proposition's plan, right? So you cannot do a counter proposition, which is effectively the same thing as the proposition's proposition. There are 4 example scenarios where somebody would say that we would, I guess, give a fine to somebody as a punishment for something, and the opposition will come up with a counter proposal saying, no, we don't give them a fine, we just put them a higher tax. And I think that this is, in most cases, something that would be the same thing. It's not significantly oppositional. You're not opposing the motion, and therefore, it's not a legitimate case to have.
Can I ask one?
Yes, please.
So, is only the opening opposition allowed to do counter-proposals, or is closing opposition also allowed to do that?
So this is a question that, depending on who will answer, you will get a different answer. I think that for the purposes of this tournament, it's fine if the closing team also does a counter proposal. In terms of how you are then weighed off against proposition teams, it would be probably advisable to give a POI about your counter proposal in order for them to be allowed to engage, because that makes it easier for the judge to believe that even if they had a chance to engage, they couldn't like very easily beat your case. You know, when there has to be a measure of robustness between the cases, when the opening doesn't have a chance to reply, in those scenarios it would be advisable to let them take a point of information or give this as a point of information to them. Whether I advise closings doing very aggressive counter propositions, not sure, but I do think that it should be allowed based on rules.
Also one last.
Yes.
So it's a real life example. So if you remember the first round of Athens UDC, the motion about this House believes that Greece should introduce significant financial benefits for individuals and companies to move out, right?
Unfortunately, I do.
Exactly. So in the round in which we have played, debated, the opening government team have claimed that they're going to build up universities in each other city in Greece other than Athens, that they're going to provide amazing logistics, build up parks, and etc., so that individuals will have an amazing time living there, that they're going to introduce some kind of factories to which companies can do so, a lot of things that Greece probably does not have money to do so, but they claim that they do have fiat to do that because, well, we're on a debating round, and so fiat is infinite, and the adjudicator upheld what they have said. So does it mean that, well, we can also follow that logic? Or
I think that this sounds very interesting and not really in line with what the UDC speaker and judge briefing would tell you. So effectively, this would depend a little bit on what the proposition's plan is. If the proposition says that their incentives for having people to move out from somewhere is like crazy sized, right? And nobody will call that out in the debate, then it's very hard for you as a judge to step in. But generally speaking, the plan should be a reasonable interpretation of the motion that could be reasonably carried out in the country in question. Given Greece doesn't have that amount of money, I think it is perfectly within the debate for the opposition to say that that is not a possible, reasonable interpretation. I think that the boundary where you can do that is very high, however. So if they just say we're going to give money and tax breaks to these companies and so on, that's obviously clear. Even if they have some building program and so on, it's obviously clear. But if it goes to a degree that is evident and clear for an average informed global citizen who has seen from the newspapers that Greece is very much struggling with their debt load, that this cannot be done, then I think that we're at the point where opposition should probably call it out and say that this cannot be done. Unfortunately, it's very hard to give a clear line, and if you were to ever challenge the proposition's policy, the implementation of the policy as unreasonable, you would have to give good reasoning as to why you think it is unreasonable, so the judge will not be entirely confused by the situation.
And the last thing,
yes.
If you don't mind. So it's also this House believes that Greece motion, right? It's not necessarily this House as Greece would do something.
Yeah, you're right. Oh yeah, you're right.
So does it mean that we should describe what's a likely way to happen?
Yes.
So in this motion we shouldn't have fiat in general.
Yeah, you're actually correct, right? So if this motion was a policy motion, this House as Greece would do something. In that scenario, the government would be allowed to decide on what things Greece would do within what is reasonable. If this House believes that Greece should do something, then the government doesn't have any right to automatically define what Greece will do. They will have to explain what the most likely thing is. Okay. How likely are they supposed to, how large are these likely to be, and then the opposition can contest this likelihood. Yeah, you are absolutely correct in this. Okay, sorry. No problem.
Sorry for a question.
Yes, please.
So you said that counterprop should require the same amount of resources?
Yes.
What if it requires less, if it is more efficient?
Well, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. That's probably just an advantage for your case. You can then just explain that it's even better because we can use the rest of the money for something else, right? It's okay. Don't exceed the amount of resources the proposition is using. Okay, extension of this speech is very briefly. Closing these have the burden to provide new substantive arguments or responses that are better, not just new, but better than those that are provided by the opening team. And this is called as the extension. Generally, the extension should be present in the member speech, and the whip speech should then not include new arguments. What is then permissible content is one, comparisons between existing arguments, so explaining why our argument is better than the other arguments. Two, responses. So that's even if you bring a new response, that's entirely fine as long as it's a response to another argument. And thirdly, additions to arguments provided in extensions, whereby it is understandable based on the extension what this argument means and what parts it includes, and you are just doing some additional analysis that can be predicted already to take place in a way that the other side already has had a fair chance to respond. So you can develop the argument further, you can make it deeper, but you should not expand it a lot, because that is probably something that has not been foreseeable for the other side and then has to be considered new material. The rule for judges in how they should consider new material in the whip speech is effectively whether you believe that the other side whip speaker could have predicted this as this is part of the case based on the extension. If yes, then probably in most scenarios it's not new material. Fantastic. This is the last line. Adjudication takes place in a manner where you rank from first to fourth, given that there are 4 teams in the debate. Comparisons between arguments are provided, and then an explanation for these comparisons needs to be given, or like an explanation of the call needs to be given, so that there's an explanation for why each team ranks below or above another team. Then feedback should also be provided to teams, both in general and people who want the individual feedback. They can then approach the judges for that. A speaker scale will be used to grade each of the individual speeches on a grade or on a ranking from 50 to 100. This is the European University Debating Championship scale that has been the same since Warsaw 2016. In terms of adjudication, effectively what judges should look into and how they should proceed, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail soon. But between 2 teams, you should consider what these teams say, what the arguments are, effectively, what they prove, so what is just asserted, and where do we have some explanation, and then preferably consider the parts where you have the explanation more than the ones where you don't, and then try to see what responses are given and how these arguments interact with each other. So after the 2 teams have spoken, what they have responded to each other, and what therefore stands of each of these arguments in comparison to the other team, and then attempt to weigh off in the end these arguments in some way to see who won that comparison. That's it in terms of speaker briefing. It is a